Thank you, James. I suppose once upon a time I was a social work academic, but for the last 4 years, I feel as if I've moved from one community into another community, and I've moved into the community of adult safeguarding policy and practice. And it's from that perspective, I think, that I shall be in the main speaking for the next 15 to 20 minutes. But thank you for the introduction. And Amy, thank you for the elephant, because it is my favourite animal. I've had a sense also of deja vu, some unsettling deja vu as I've been listening, because whilst I may not have been a social worker for quite as many years as Baroness Armstrong, I was certainly practicing in the mid to later 70s, and I can remember social work and social work education being castigated at that time and into the early 80s for daring to suggest that there was something called institutional oppression, daring to suggest that there was something called institutional racism, and indeed also daring to suggest that there was something which we then knew as older age abuse. And it seems to me that to some degree we're still learning particular lessons. But as both Amy and Baroness Armstrong have already indicated, and James too, we are at an interesting edge at the moment, and it's the edge of opportunity as well as the edge of crisis. And it will be interesting to see whether some of the issues that Amy and Baroness Armstrong in particular have identified, it will be interesting to see whether they are put back into the too difficult box, or whether this time central government, working in partnership with local government, will grasp particular nettles and transform the system in the way that James and Baroness Armstrong in particular were highlighting. I'm going to draw on experience in the last 4 years in particular as a chair of Safeguarding Adult Boards, as a writer of Safeguarding Adult Reviews, and as someone who has looked at the issues of self-neglect and multiple exclusion homelessness with colleagues, including Dr. A.D. Cooper, who will be known to many of you. And I'm going to try to tease out some lessons from that, as well as some of the more recent lessons, particularly from a London perspective, which is where I practice in relation to the response to COVID-19. So the next slide, please. I was really grateful to Amy for introducing the voice of lived experience. Thank you for that, Amy. I am always moved by people who have the courage and the resilience to share their lived experience. And I was once facilitating a conference seminar when a civil servant in the Department of Health and Social Care was asked, how do we get politicians to listen? And her response was, tell human stories. Amy, you told your human story this afternoon, and on this slide, I've put 2 human stories, both derived from Safeguarding Adult reviews. And what they force me, and I hope you, to do is to really hear and respond to the voice of lived experience, and to really ask whether you as individual practitioners and managers and the systems of which you are a part really do hear the voice of lived experience, or whether, as Amy captured quite graphically before sharing the elephant, whether your face glazes over and wishes to move on. So the voice of lived experience. Next slide, please. Out of the voice of lived experience, we can derive some really powerful lessons. And implicit in much of what Amy was saying are some of those lessons. I can remember Bill Utting, who will no doubt be someone that many of you in the ADASS community will remember, talking in the 1970s and I think early 80s about the loss of humanity in the services of which we are a part, and talking about the poverty of provision. In this particular slide, I've tried to capture some of the other lessons that we are continuing to learn. The fact that we may apply unhelpful, oppressive, discriminatory stereotypes on people, that we may be guilty of unconscious bias or confirmation bias, such that we only consider the information that accords with the perspective that we have come to view a particular situation through. And that in the work that we do, we address the symptoms rather than the fundamental causes. So whether you're looking at multiple exclusion homelessness or you are looking at adults who self-neglect, very often the system response is to deal with a symptom. It's not looking at the problems behind the symptom that is presented. And too often in safeguarding adult reviews, we hear that there has been insufficient curiosity, perhaps because of the demands on time, perhaps because of a shortage of resources, perhaps because of the workloads that people in health and social care are carrying. But we hear time and time again the message that there has been insufficient curiosity about why it is that a particular situation is being presented to us, and sometimes not for the first time. And that leads me to reference the first National Safeguarding Adult Review thematic analysis that I, with some colleagues, are doing on behalf of LGA, ADASS and the Department of Health and Social Care, which will report at the end of August. And one of the things that emerges from the 231 SARs that are within this thematic analysis across 2 financial years, 17-18 and 18-19, is that too often safeguarding adult reviews are not talking about the national context in which social care currently operates, and that James, in his introductory remarks, and Baroness Armstrong in particular, captured so graphically. Too often, safeguarding adult reviews are silent about the national context, whether that is shortcomings in relation to the legal rules, oppression as demonstrated through the legal rules, particularly in relation to people who have no recourse to public funds, whether it is about the impact of financial austerity and the impact on our health and social care organisations, our third sector organisations. Too often, SARs are silent on that particular context. Too often also, SARs are silent on ethnicity and culture. We are in the early stages of analysing the data that we have obtained from 231 SARs in our sample, but very many of them make absolutely no reference at all to ethnicity and culture. And at a time when we are learning yet again that Black Lives Matter, at a time when we are having to learn yet again about the importance of parity of voice, it is not acceptable that safeguarding adult reviews are not addressing in their analysis of cases the impact of ethnicity and culture, the impact on that particular individual, and the impact also on the services surrounding that particular individual. Next slide, please. If we are serious about addressing social justice and inclusion, if we are serious about addressing multiple exclusion homelessness, or adults who self-neglect, or any other type of abuse and neglect that is referred to one or more of the partner agencies within the world of adult safeguarding, we have to have a whole system focus. And that includes, as you will see here, the legal, policy and financial context that I have already referred to. It refers also to interagency governance. So, for example, how safeguarding adult boards with their responsibilities for safeguarding adult reviews work alongside CCGs with responsibility for the reviews of the deaths of learning disabled people, and work alongside our housing colleagues in relation to looking at fatality reviews in respect of people who died on the streets. It is also important to look at the organisational and interagency context. And here I would echo both what James has said and in particular what Baroness Armstrong has said so far this afternoon. And that is that COVID represents an opportunity, and that COVID has already demonstrated either that strong partnership relationships have become even stronger, or that partnership relationships that were perhaps not as strong as we would have ideally liked have become much stronger as local government with CCGs, acute trusts and other partners have endeavoured to respond as effectively as possible to the crisis that has been presented to them. We're looking to the future, and that has to address all of the systems that are captured in that particular diagram. Next slide, please. And safeguarding adult reviews are not necessarily always about bad news, although the vast majority of reviews that are commissioned are actually commissioned where there are concerns rather than where there is evidence of good practice from which we can learn. A particular review that I would commend for looking at good practice as much as for looking at shortcomings in practice would be the joint review done by the then Newcastle Safeguarding Children Board and the Newcastle Safeguarding Adult Board on the sexual exploitation of children and young people, and also young adults and adults with learning disabilities. That review identifies how local government with partner organisations, including in the third sector, responded innovatively, creatively and positively when people were disclosing sexual exploitation. And the review identifies that how Newcastle responded was in many respects leading edge from which other police forces, local authorities and other agencies could positively respond. And that review is one that actually does identify the responsibility of central government as well as local government and its partners to respond to the challenge of social justice and inclusion for, in this case, people who experience sexual exploitation. And it challenges us to redefine, in a way that children's safeguarding has gone on to do through the work of Carmen Thurman on contextual safeguarding, to challenge how we actually understand both children's safeguarding and adult safeguarding. On this slide, you've got a different review, which found again both positive practice, particularly the willingness of the local authority to commission agencies with specific expertise, even when that agency was charging more for its services than the local authority might ordinarily expect to pay, as well as highlighting some repetitive lessons about the importance of services working together to maximise, where possible, a person's autonomy and self-determination, whilst also seeking to reduce the risks to which their decisions were exposing them. Next slide, please. I found it quite helpful in relation to thinking about people who are homeless and people who are sleeping on the streets to think about multiple exclusion homelessness. What they need is not just a roof over their head, important though that is. And increasingly, I've come to the conclusion that whether you're focusing on homelessness or you're focusing on self-neglect or some other type of care and support need or abuse and neglect, to think about the number of exclusions that people may be experiencing, whether that be poverty, adverse experiences both in childhood and in adulthood, whether it is dealing with mental distress, whether it is, as Baroness Armstrong identified, dealing with issues such as diabetes. And one of the things I have learned about studying and working with people who self-neglect and hoard is how frequently diabetes is part of the picture. So it's encouraging us to think about multiple exclusions, irrespective of the service user or patient group with whom we are interacting at any one particular time. And this speaks to points which James and Baroness Armstrong have already made this afternoon. And that is that if we could start with a blank sheet and design services from scratch, we would not have done what happened in 1948, which is to have separated health and social care. And there are local authorities in England with partner agencies that have sought to achieve greater integration between health and social care, Salford being one of those particular areas. Next slide, please. Amy and Baroness Armstrong and indeed James have all emphasised the importance of relationships and the importance of resilience within those relationships to sustain, challenge and change. What has struck me as a Safeguarding Adult Board Chair in London is the strength of those relationships in dealing with the pandemic crisis. We need to build on the strength of those relationships in London and in England. We need to build on the strength of those relationships to do the doable, because whatever challenges local authorities and their partner agencies have faced in London, in many respects, local authorities with their partner agencies have done the doable, sometimes at the risk of making a political observation in spite of, rather than because of, the efforts and the contribution of central government. We need to build on that doable if we really are serious about social justice and inclusion going forward. Next slide, please. But we need, as I've already identified, to focus on one particular system in particular, and that is the legal, policy and financial context within which you are all operating, and indeed myself too, when I write Safeguarding Adult Reviews and chair Safeguarding Adult Board meetings. We also need to recognise something that Norman Lamb talked about when he was both Minister of State, but also subsequently before he stepped down as an MP. And that is that even when there is central government determination to transform a particular system, in this case, the system that was exposed by the inquiry into Winterbourne View, transformation does not necessarily come easily. However, COVID-19 and our response to that pandemic, particularly in relation to people experiencing multiple exclusion homelessness, has demonstrated that it is possible to transform a system, in this case, the response to people who are homeless, when there is both financial investment and a determination that something is doable from central government and local government and its partners. So we need to learn not just the lesson about how difficult it has been to transform the lives of people who were living or are living in institutions like Winterbourne View, but we also need to learn the lesson from what has been possible as a result of the pandemic, using people experiencing multiple exclusion homelessness as an example. And we need to build on that doableness and not lose it. Next slide, please. And we need to challenge ourselves when we're doing this, because sadly Winterbourne View was not the last inquiry in relation to lessons to be learned in that particular area of policy and practice. There have been a number of reviews since, for example, Mendip House, which once again identified that for a particular group of people who are reliant on state care, we are not providing care derived from the best evidence of positive practice that we have available. There are some systemic issues here. You might even call them wicked issues here. Now represents an opportunity to learn real lessons and to take things out of the too difficult box and really to put on the table the reform, the rejuvenation of social care in the way that James articulated and that I would strongly support. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide. It's emphasising, I think, what all of us have tried to articulate in our different ways this afternoon, and that is that we now have an opportunity. I think I'm right in saying that the Chinese word for crisis actually translates as opportunity. We have an opportunity now to learn lessons about what determination and investment and a recognition of the need to change can actually achieve. This is everybody's business. It's also each of our businesses. Leadership begins with me. Leadership begins with you. Leadership is something that is everybody's responsibility. And in wrapping up, I would like to go to a particular chorus in a song by Leonard Cohen that, for me at any rate, captures why 40 years or so after qualifying as a social worker, I am still engaged in this line of work and hold a passion for it. To the shores of need, past the reefs of greed, through the squalls of hate, sail on, sail on. Thank you very much.